But Saudi Arabia has decided to terminate its 50-year-old petrodollar agreement with the United States.
Saudi Arabia has officially ended its 50-year petrodollar agreement with the United States.
The dollar would collapse, the stock market would collapse, the bond market would collapse, banking system would collapse, the insurance companies would collapse, everything. This is the Great Reset.
Okay, this came in as a shocker. No mainstream media gave attention to this, as we just got over with the elections and we are still in the hangover of the results. On June 9, 2024, the long-standing petrodollar agreement came to an end between US and Saudi Arabia. Let me tell you the entire story and what it means for India in the next 4 minutes. This agreement was in place for more than 50 years, and the end of this agreement marks a huge shift in global economics. Now, you might be thinking, what shit am I talking about, and how does the agreement between US and Saudi even benefit us Indians? In today's video, I'll explain what's happening, why it's happening, and how this will affect us and our future generations. So with that said, let's get into it. What do you think as soon as someone says global trade? Importing and exporting of goods and services with other countries. Simple, right? Now, imagine this. I'm running a TV store. One day, a guy called Sham walks into the store. I sold a TV to Sham in exchange for rupees. Next day, a guy called Peter walks into the store. Peter is basically from UK. I sold the TV to Peter in exchange for dollars. But why am I selling it in dollars? Peter's local currency is pounds as he lives in the UK. My local currency here in India is rupees, but we are still trading in dollars. If we Google why, we get this answer. It is a stable currency, the US has a strong and growing economy, and blah 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 blah. All this is true, but the real reason is connection of the US dollar with oil. Crude oil is one of the world's highest traded products after automobile, and all the countries that import oil pay for it in US dollars. The system dates back to the early 1970s. That's why when most people around the world think about what money actually is, they're probably thinking about the US dollar. But it wasn't always like that though. Between 1720 to 1815, if you ask someone to name a currency, they would have probably said French Libra, because it was France that held the reserve status at that time. But then if you ask someone to name a currency between 1815 to 1920, you would have probably heard British Pound. During World War II, while other countries were busy fighting and allocating all of their manpower and resources to the war, the United States capitalized on this situation. The US became a war merchant. Just like how in a gold rush, the person who starts selling shovels becomes extremely rich, the US made use of its capital and workforce to become a major supplier of cotton, wheat, automobiles, machinery, and thousands of other goods to countries around the world. Most of this trade was being carried out with gold as the exchange medium. So the US ended up with 75% of world's monetary gold, and their gold reserves soared to nearly 20,000 tons by 1940. By taking advantage of this situation, the US gathered 44 countries to sign the Bretton Woods Agreement. According to this agreement, 44 countries agreed to peg their currency against the US dollar, and the US dollar ultimately was pegged to gold. Now what does this mean? This means that if tomorrow you take the US dollar and return it back to the US, they would give you an equivalent amount of gold in return. Now the question is, why did these countries sign the Bretton Woods Agreement, and what was their benefit? Well, firstly, the Bretton Woods Agreement said that they would back the US dollars with gold, with 1 ounce of gold worth $35. For example, when Brazil sold goods to Japan and received $1 million, even if Brazil did not trust Japan, they knew the 1 million US dollars they received could be exchanged for gold with the United States. This assurance made the US dollar a trusted instrument for trade. Otherwise, if they conducted their trade using Japanese yen, several issues could arise. Today, 1000 yen might buy you 1 gram of gold, but tomorrow, Japan could print more money and declare that 1 gram of gold is worth 20,000 yen. This would collapse the entire value of trade. This system wasn't just about commodities. It was about cementing the dollar's role as the world's reserve currency. Being the one money to rule them all gave the US access to superpower of economic stability. Let me explain with a fun example. Imagine you have a special retro car that everyone wants. This car is very rare, and there are only a few of them in the whole world. Because it is so rare, it becomes very valuable. This is similar to gold. Gold is a special shiny metal that is hard to find, so it is very valuable. Now, if we took all the gold that has ever been found in the world and put it in one place, it would fit inside a building that is only 7 stories tall.
That was ever mined. You could fit it into a building that's about 7 stories high and about 5,000 square feet. That's it. There's no CEO of gold. Nobody can manipulate it. It has its value just due to its own properties, due to its own, rarity.
Gold is so rare and valuable, no one can just make more of it whenever they want. This makes gold very special and trustworthy for trading things. The US had a lot of gold, so people trusted their money because they knew it was backed by gold. Stability also makes it possible for countries to trade with each other. Countries like to keep their wealth in a money that is stable, which means it doesn't lose its value very quickly. They choose US dollar because they knew it is reliable and won't lose its value suddenly. This helps protect their wealth from things like inflation, which is when money loses its value over time and you can't buy as much with it. That's why big countries like Japan, China and the UK keep a lot of their money in US dollars. They store their money in something called foreign exchange reserves. Imagine these reserves like a giant piggy banks filled with US dollars. These countries have saved up to 7 to 8 trillion dollars. But then another secret superpower of US dollar was born: the ability to control world's energy. Let's go back to World War II. During this time, the world was fighting a brutal war with new weapons powered by a very important substance, oil. Germany lost that war partly because they didn't have enough oil to keep up their machines running. The US realized early on that having access to oil would determine which countries would be powerful. During that time, US and British companies were looking all over the world for oil. They had the technology to find and extract it. One day, a company from California wanted to explore the vast Saudi desert for oil. After a few years, their hard work paid off. On March 3rd, 1938, they struck oil in a small patch of desert. This was a big deal because oil was like liquid gold. Back then, Saudi Arabia wasn't very rich because they had just started producing oil. But during the war, Italy dropped bombs on Saudi Arabia to target the American facilities, which made it hard for Saudi Arabia to produce oil at its full capacity. They desperately needed protection, and that's when Franklin D. Roosevelt, the US president, saw a big opportunity. President Roosevelt noticed that oil was the key to the future development and power. So in 1945, he had a very important meeting with the King of Saudi Arabia. They made a deal that would change everything. The US promised to protect Saudi Arabia and provide military equipment. In return, the Saudi king agreed to sell oil in US dollars. This was huge because the oil well they were digging was the largest in the world. But the question is, why was selling oil in dollars such a big deal? Remember the Bretton Woods Agreement? It said that countries could trade their currency for US dollars, and the US would exchange those dollars for gold. But by 1970s, the US economy was struggling. The gold reserves had fallen from 22,000 tons in 1950 to just 10,000 tons in 1970. This was due to various reasons like the Vietnamese War and the rising prices of gold. Because of this, President Richard Nixon announced that US would no longer exchange dollars for gold. This meant the Bretton Woods system collapsed in 1973. Instead, a new deal was made. In return for military and political support, Saudi Arabia ensured that oil transactions were conducted exclusively in the US dollars. This gave birth to the petrodollar. From then on, the US dollar was no longer backed by gold, but by black gold or oil. All countries needed US dollars to pay for their oil, so they had large reserves of US currency. For example, if India or other countries needed to buy the most important commodity, oil, they needed US dollars. And from that point on, oil was priced in USD. This arrangement was beneficial for both sides. Saudi Arabia gained economic stability and security through US military support, while the US secured a steady supply of oil and a steady demand for its currency globally. The value of a currency was determined by what it could buy in the global market. The US dollar could buy the most valuable commodity of the century, oil. So most countries had their forex reserves in US dollars to buy oil from the Arabs. This is how the US dollar was first backed by gold, then by oil, and now by oil trade. This made the dollar the global reserve currency, reinforcing its dominance in the international trade and finance. And that's the story of how the US dollar became so powerful. I know this was a very long and boring history lesson of US, but now things are getting really interesting. The Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia announced that he would not renew this contract. Now, Saudi Arabia can trade or deal in currencies outside of the US dollar. They can now trade oil in yen, rupees, euros, Chinese yuan, and other currencies. The decision is part of a much bigger trend where countries are ditching dollars in international trade and oil transactions. This has been happening in the background since the invasion of Ukraine by Russia and Western world subsequently placing sanctions on Russia to limit its exports. The sanctions never worked as all they did was form a new trading alliance and change the partnership agreements for good. Why the sudden change? Well, as the US started producing more shale oil and relations with Iran got better, Saudi Arabia felt less important to the US. Plus, China is now their biggest trading partner. So, switching to Chinese yuan makes more sense for them. Speaking of China, Saudi's potential pivot is a part of a larger shift towards the economic powerhouses of the East, especially the BRICS nations: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. These emerging economies have been steadily challenging the US-led global financial system. They have created their own international banking systems and are trading more in local currencies to reduce dependence on the US dollar. And you know who has a pivotal role to play in all this? As a key BRICS member and the world's fifth largest economy, India's stance could majorly influence how this petrodollar saga unfolds. New Delhi has been vocal about joining the Chinese-led Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and using more local currencies for trade to bypass US sanctions. All signs point towards India aligning itself with the BRICS bloc's anti-dollar motives. But let's circle back to the Saudis. Why now? Because it makes sense for a country to trade how they choose and to sell their assets in the currency they want. Countries like India, China, and Russia, for example, have been reducing their dependence on dollar for a while, which is why China recently dumped a bunch of US Treasury bonds, and it's also why dollar as a reserve currency reached a 14-year low. Apart from the shifting geopolitical alliances, they have got economic motivations too. The Saudis desperately want to diversify their energy exports and revenues beyond just oil before it's too late. Embracing other currencies could give them that flexibility. But what happens when the world becomes a little less dependent on the dollar? Until now, the dollar has been the world's most important currency. Every economist has a different opinion on this one question. But let's look into some basic facts. The US was once a top economy where everyone wanted to invest their money. But now, people realize that there are many other good places to explore. Secondly, the US is on a downward slope and many regional powers have emerged. For example, China has become a major regional power. India is also an emerging economy, and Russia is also making its presence felt. Even though 88% of the foreign exchange transactions still happen in the US dollars, the dollar is weakening. However, these changes might take time. Every country is trying to set up its own system. For example, China has increased trading using the renminbi. Russia is moving towards gold, and some nations have legalized cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. Check out this report that BRICS nations might bring out their own currency as well. In short, the global reliance on the dollar is decreasing, but this transition is gradual. So don't worry, the value of dollars you are holding will not fall overnight. Meanwhile, if this petrodollar unraveling does happen, India actually stands to be a major beneficiary on multiple fronts. To start, we could avoid US sanctions and trade more easily with Russia and Iran for oil using our own money. This would be a big deal for our energy needs. Indian exporters and the rupee would get a big boost too. If more countries start accepting rupee payments, the demand for the currency will increase, possibly making it an important global currency. This could help the Reserve Bank of India import more dollars cheaply into its forex reserves through nostro-vostro accounts held with the overseas bank, making our external funds even stronger. The petrodollar system, which seemed unbreakable, is now uncertain due to geopolitical changes. We don't know if this major shift will happen, but one thing is clear: India and the BRICS countries have a big chance to change the global economy in their favor. It's an opportunity we can't miss. So stay tuned, because the next few years could be really exciting. Who knows? Maybe Bollywood will even make a movie about this. If you enjoyed learning about this global economic story, hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe for more amazing story about geopolitics. Until next time, keep chasing your goals and most importantly, keep learning, because you just got a lot smarter about the world today.